All right, this is the external dissection of the lumbricus earthworm. So we have the dorsal side right here. This is a little bit darker than the ventral surface. Again, ventral is the belly, dorsal is the back. Here's the ventral surface of the worm and the dorsal surface of the worm. Later, I'm going to be making an incision directly down the middle of the dorsal side of the earthworm. The anterior end, of course, is the end that contains the mouth. So this is the anterior end of the earthworm, and its mouth is right here. Okay, you can kind of see where I was able to put the probe in. The posterior end is, of course, the opposite of the anterior end. So this right here is the posterior end with the anus, which you will be describing later on. Back up towards the anterior end, you may have noticed that there's a little cone-shaped structure in front of the mouth, and that is the prostomium. Pro means before, stome means mouth, so the prostomium is located in front of the mouth. And again, it's cone-shaped, which is very, very useful for burrowing and digging into the soil. If we move back 25 or so metameres, which again, metameres are segments. If we move back about 25 or so metameres, we have this smoother, lighter colored structure. This is actually called the clitellum, and the clitellum is responsible for secreting a mucus sheath during mating, which allows for the mating process to occur on land. Again, these are organisms that are on land, but do require a lot of moisture for most of their body processes. The setae of the earthworm are going to be located primarily on the ventral surface. They are extraordinarily small, so they're very difficult to see with the naked eye. Even with a fairly tight zoom, it's going to be very difficult to see the setae. They look sort of like stubble. I can actually feel them with my probe. They are very, very short. They kind of feel like stubble. There are also nephridiopores on each segment, but they're even smaller than the setae, which make it very difficult to see. Moving back up towards the anterior end. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Right around metamere 15. We've got two structures, one right here and the other one right here. Those right there are the male genital pores, and directly posterior to the male genital pores are the sperm grooves. So sperm is released from the male genital pores, and it will glide down the sperm grooves. There's a couple of sperm grooves on each side of the worm, okay? Just very, very shallow notches along the body wall, and the sperm will glide along the sperm grooves during mating. Other pores that are involved in the mating process but are too small to see are seminal receptacle pores. These are the openings to the seminal receptacles that will be pointed out in the internal anatomy dissection. There are also ovipores, which are responsible for releasing the eggs from the body. And then our final structure for the external anatomy is the cuticle. The cuticle is this thin, it looks kind of like peeling skin. It's very waxy. It's acellular. Okay, there are no cells in this, but this is the cuticle, and it does help protect the skin of the worm, and it does prevent the worm from desiccating. You can see it kind of peeling away very nicely from this worm. That's its cuticle. Now we will begin the internal dissection of the earthworm. The peritoneum is the tissue that lines the inner body wall. So once it's cut open, you can see it's kind of shiny. Part of that is because this was sprayed. The longitudinal muscles will run from the anterior end of the worm all the way back to the posterior end. They're very difficult to see, but they are underneath the peritoneum. They will lengthen when the worm lengthens, and when the worm shortens, they contract. Then there are circular muscles that run basically around the worm's body, and those circular muscles are going to work in opposition to the longitudinal muscles. If we move back to the posterior end of the worm, it's a little bit easier to see this. we're looking for a septum. And remember, septa are what divide each of the metameres. So this tissue right here forms a septum. And if we kind of parse away, you can really see the septa. There's one right here and another septum right here. Okay. Remember, those are going to kind of help hold the intestine in place as well. We'll move back up to the anterior end of the worm. If you remember, the mouth was located at the very anterior end of the worm. I do have a pin through the prostomium now. That's going to help us visualize what's going on internally. The pharynx is located right here. It's very muscular, and it's responsible for helping draw food back posterior into the digestive system. Posterior to the pharynx, the esophagus is currently covered by several organs, but the esophagus runs from right here all the way back to about here. Okay, it's just a thin tube. So again, from here to here is where the esophagus is located underneath all these organs, and I'll go over those shortly. This structure right here is the crop, and the crop is responsible for storing undigested material until it gets to this structure right here, which is extremely muscular. This is the gizzard. The gizzard usually contains small stones, and like I said, it's very muscular. So what the gizzard does is it grinds the food prior to it entering this structure right here, and this right here is the intestine. The intestine runs from metamere 20 all the way back the entire length of the earthworm to the anus. And the anus is located right here. Let's see, a little itty bitty opening right there. It doesn't look too different from the anterior end, but that is not its mouth, that's an anus. Moving back up towards the anterior end, we're going to cover some of the reproductive structures first before we move on to the circulatory and then nervous system. So you'll notice that there are some light tan colored structures up towards the anterior end. These are all reproductive structures. They all look kind of similar to each other, but they are several of them are different from each other. These smaller structures right here are called seminal receptacles. So receptacles receive, so these are going to be the structures that receive sperm from another worm. Seminal receptacles receive from another worm. Posterior to those and quite a bit larger are these seminal vesicles. These actually store the worm's own sperm prior to them being released from the body. Okay. So the seminal receptacles are these little guys. The seminal vesicles are the larger structures. Testes and ovaries are very small, so we're not going to be able to identify them. But we are going to cover the aortic arches. So now we've moved on to the circulatory system. So I'm going to move some of these seminal receptacles out of the way, and we can actually see some of these really dark structures in here. This right here is an aortic arch, and we have another one right here. Okay, so basically metameres 4 through 8, each one has 2 separate aortic arches. They're on either side of the body. Here's another one that is on the worm's right side of the body. So those are 3 of the 10 aortic arches, and they're responsible for pumping the blood in the worm. We have the dorsal blood vessel. Since this is the dorsal side of the worm, you can see the dorsal blood vessel right here. It does run the entire length of the worm. And remember, blood actually gets carried from the posterior end of the worm all the way up. So it would be going from here up. It would be going from here up toward the brain, or the suprapharyngeal ganglion. So here is where the blood would go, just like that direction, okay? I'm gonna move some of the digestive structures out of the way so that you can see both the ventral blood vessel and hopefully the ventral nerve cord. Oh, beautiful. Okay. Ruptured that intestine a little bit, but that's all right. Okay. So looking in here, we have two sort of thin lines that run the length on the ventral side of the organism. The darker colored line right here that I'm grabbing at, that is the ventral aorta or ventral blood vessel. And then finally this light colored structure, there we go, this light line right here, that is the ventral nerve cord. Okay, so ventral nerve cord, and then the darker one right here is the ventral blood vessel. Our final structure that we're going to cover is the dorsal suprapharyngeal ganglion, which is a very long, large name for a very tiny, tiny structure. So again, here's the pharynx. If it's dorsal, it's going to be on this surface. If it is suprapharyngeal, it's going to be in front of the pharynx. And I need to try it out a little bit because it's very, very difficult to see when there's so much moisture in this cavity. All right, so there is a very small white protrusion here, and another one on this side of the pin right here. So 1, 2. That's the ganglia, guys. Not very big, not a very big brain at all when you consider that the length of the worm, that's the whole length of the worm. So if you have any questions, don't forget to email your teachers, and I hope you enjoyed learning about the internal and external anatomy of your earthworm. Have a great day.